Usually when we talk about a map of global alliances, there's this expectation of clean, sharp lines.
Yeah, like a vintage Cold War map, right.
Exactly. The one hanging in, like, every high school history classroom. You look at it, and you see this bold, undeniable line drawn straight across a continent.
Right, where geopolitics is basically structured as a giant, very straightforward game of Risk.
Red or blue, yeah.
You knew exactly where the borders were.
Categorized by, tanks massed on borders or the nuclear silos pointed across an ocean.
Yeah.
And it was terrifying, sure, but there was a certain, I don't know, comfort in its predictability. We like our battle lines to be visible.
We really do.
But then you step into the reality of the 21st century, and suddenly that old paper map is, well, it's entirely useless.
It is, because the lines aren't being drawn with tanks or physical treaties anymore. I mean, we are looking at a geopolitical landscape that is completely fundamentally fractured.
Right, forget the old maps.
Yeah.
Today's battle lines are being drawn with, like, microscopic semiconductors.
Yeah.
They're drawn with invisible fiber optic cables buried beneath the ocean floor. And with massive commercial deep water ports in countries most people couldn't even place on a globe.
Exactly. It's a totally different battlefield.
It is a completely new world, and that is our mission for this deep dive. Today, we are exploring a world that is rapidly fracturing.
We really are.
We're unpacking the new architecture of global alliances, who stands where, and looking at how nations across the globe are being forced, sometimes kicking and screaming, to pick sides.
Yeah, and a really high-stakes, incredibly complex geopolitical contest.
And to map this out, we are pulling from a highly rigorous stack of sources.
We really are. We've got deep geopolitical analyses from David Shambaugh, Edward Fishman, Kishore Mahbubani, Kevin Rudd, Elizabeth Economy, and Dmitry Aperovich, alongside Garrett M. Graff.
It's a big stack.
Huge. And this research spans everything from the obscure mechanics of the global semiconductor supply chain all the way to the shifting military dynamics of the Indo-Pacific.
It's a massive amount of research. And because we are dealing with sources ranging from, Aperovich to Mahbubani, we are navigating fiercely opposing, highly politicized viewpoints on global superpowers.
Absolutely. There are a lot of strong opinions in these texts.
So just to be completely clear with you, the listener, our job today isn't to pick a side.
Right. No sides.
We aren't here to endorse a specific ideology or, advocate for any particular foreign policy. We are simply mapping out exactly how both sides are playing the board.
We're just unpacking the friction points and the strategic realities that are presented in this research.
Exactly. Dissecting the architecture of a new kind of conflict. And to really understand that architecture, you have to look at the first major theater of this contest, right? The Indo-Pacific.
Yeah, the Indo-Pacific is where it all starts. The United States is actively trying to build a modern fortress there, but the design of this fortress looks wildly different from anything constructed during the 20th century.
So let's start there. How exactly is this Western shield being built? Because it definitely doesn't look like NATO.
It doesn't look like NATO at all, no. If you want to understand the new Western shield, you have to look at the rebirth of the Quad.
The Quad.
Right. The Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. So that's the United States, Japan, India, and Australia.
Okay.
And what's fascinating about the Quad is how it was initially perceived versus what it has actually become.
How is it perceived?
Well, back in 2017, when Japan's Shinzo Abe tried to get these diplomats to meet on the sidelines of an ASEAN summit, Beijing's reaction was essentially just mockery.
Really? They just laughed it off?
Pretty much. The Chinese foreign minister at the time, Wang Yi, dismissed the Quad as a headline-grabbing idea. He literally compared it to sea foam in the Pacific or Indian Ocean.
Sea foam, wow.
Right, the implication being that it might froth up and look interesting for a second, but it would inevitably quickly dissipate into nothing.
A very poetic, very deliberate diplomatic insult.
Extremely deliberate.
But it absolutely did not dissipate.
Not even close. I mean, since 2019, and especially after the leaders met in person in Washington in 2021, the Quad has hardened into a formidable bloc.
Right.
But this is the crucial distinction. It is not a formal military alliance.
Right. There's no Article 5.
Exactly. There is no mutual defense obligation like NATO's Article 5, where an attack on one is an attack on all.
So what are they actually agreeing to do then?
Well, if you look at their joint statements, they have crystallized around initiatives that sound, honestly, surprisingly civilian on the surface.
Like what?
They talk about expanding cooperation on vaccine distribution, climate change mitigation, infrastructure financing.
Okay, that sounds pretty standard.
Right, but the real weapon, the core of this bloc, is their focus on securing supply chains for critical emerging technologies.
Oh.
We are talking about semiconductors, 5G networks, and cybersecurity.
Which makes total sense, right? Because if the battle lines are drawn with microscopic chips, you don't need a treaty about tanks. You need a treaty about supply chains.
Exactly, you have to secure the tech.
But while the Quad is operating somewhat in the open with these, civilian-sounding initiatives, the U.S. and its allies were also moving in the shadows.
They absolutely were.
Which brings us to September 2021. Out of nowhere, the leaders of Australia, the UK, and the U.S. dropped this massive bombshell.
AUKUS.
AUKUS, yeah, that was huge.
A highly secretive trilateral security partnership that seemingly just materialized overnight.
And the shockwaves from AUKUS were monumental. Fundamentally, AUKUS is a pact designed to share highly classified, closely guarded military technology.
And the centerpiece of that, the thing that grabbed all the headlines, was the submarines, right?
Right. It was an agreement for the U.S. and the UK to share their most secretive nuclear submarine propulsion technology with Australia.
So they're letting Australia build a fleet of nuclear-powered attack submarines in Adelaide.
Exactly.
Let's pause on the submarines for a second, because I think it's really easy to hear nuclear submarine and just think, oh, it's just a bigger boat.
Right, yeah. But the difference between a traditional diesel-electric submarine and a nuclear-powered one isn't just a matter of what fuel you pump into the engine. It alters the entire strategic geometry of the ocean.
It's night and day.
The sources are incredibly specific about why this technical upgrade terrified Beijing.
It changes everything about underwater warfare. So a traditional diesel-electric submarine is severely constrained by physics.
How so?
Well, it runs on batteries when it's submerged, right? And those batteries deplete. To recharge them, the submarine has to come up to the surface.
Or at least use a snorkel mast.
Exactly. It has to take in oxygen to run its diesel engines. But the moment a submarine surfaces or even breaches the water with a snorkel, it becomes incredibly vulnerable.
Because it's basically announcing its location.
Yes.
Yeah.
It creates a thermal signature, a radar signature, and a visual signature. Overhead satellites and maritime reconnaissance planes can detect that instantly.
Right.
In a modern war zone, coming up for air is practically a death sentence.
So a diesel sub is basically a scuba diver who constantly has to stick their head out of the water while surrounded by snipers.
That is a perfect analogy. Exactly.
Wow.
Now compare that to a nuclear submarine. A nuclear reactor generates its own power endlessly without needing oxygen.
So it just stays underwater.
Yes. Its range and its underwater endurance are practically infinite. The only real limitation is the psychological endurance of the crew and, the amount of food and water you can pack on board.
That's incredible.
It really is. A nuclear sub can remain submerged, deep, and completely undetectable for months at a time, moving at high speeds across the vastness of the Indo-Pacific.
And for Australia's strategic geography, acquiring that capability transforms them, right? They go from a regional coastal defense force into a power that can project unseen lethal force thousands of miles away.
Exactly. It's a massive leap in capability.
But submarines take decades to build. AUKUS isn't just about waiting around for boats in the 2030s, is it?
No, not at all. The submarines were really just the tip of the spear. The second pillar of the AUKUS Pact is perhaps even more significant in the short term.
What's the second pillar?
It's a broad agreement to jointly develop advanced military capabilities to promote security and stability.
Like what kind of tech?
We are talking about deep integration on cyber warfare capabilities, artificial intelligence, autonomous underwater vehicles, which are essentially drone swarms for the ocean hypersonic missiles, and quantum technologies.
So it's a massive binding technological alignment between three incredibly advanced nations.
Yes, it's huge.
And it caused an absolute diplomatic earthquake because, to get into this exclusive club, Australia had to burn a very, very expensive bridge.
Oh, they burned it to the ground.
They already had a $90 billion deal in place to buy conventional diesel-powered subs from France.
Yep.
And Australia abruptly scrapped that deal. They didn't even consult Paris. They just tore up the contract.
Yeah, the French reaction was unprecedented. The French foreign minister, Jean-Yves Le Drian, went on national television and called it a stab in the back.
A stab in the back, wow.
France temporarily recalled its ambassadors to the U.S. and Australia.
That's insane between allies.
Right. It was a stunning moment that proved alliance building in this new era isn't a polite gentleman's agreement at a cocktail party. It is ruthless, it is messy, and it is a zero-sum game.
Which perfectly illustrates the core of this new warfare.
Oh.
You noted that AUKUS is fundamentally a technology pact. That reflects a profound historical shift in how the United States is fighting this global contest.
It does.
The U.S. has entirely pivoted its primary economic weaponry. So how did that economic weaponry used to work, and what is the pivot?
Historically, particularly in the post-Cold War era, when the U.S. wanted to punish a rogue state or an adversary, think of Iran or Russia after the annexation of Crimea, it weaponized Wall Street.
Right, financial sanctions.
Exactly. It leveraged its absolute dominance of the global financial system, specifically the SWIFT messaging network and the U.S. dollar, to financially suffocate a country.
So freezing bank accounts and stuff like that.
Yeah, they would freeze central bank accounts, enact sweeping financial sanctions, and literally amputate a country from the global economy.
The Treasury Department was basically the tip of the spear.
Exactly. The White House could openly say, we are going to crater the Russian economy. But when policymakers looked at China, they realized that strategy was suicidal.
Because the U.S. and Chinese economies are like conjoined twins.
Exactly.
You can't amputate China from Wall Street without causing a catastrophic global depression that would instantly tank the American economy as well.
Precisely. The intertwining of supply chains, the sheer volume of consumer goods manufactured in China and consumed in the U.S. makes financial decoupling impossible.
Right.
So the U.S. government had to find a new choke point. If they couldn't use the Treasury Department to freeze bank accounts, they would use the Commerce Department to freeze innovation.
They weaponized Silicon Valley.
Exactly. Instead of Wall Street, they weaponized cutting-edge American technology.
And there is no better example of this than what happened to Huawei. I think everyone listening has probably heard the name Huawei, maybe seen their smartphones.
Sure.
But the sheer scale of what the U.S. did to this company and what Huawei actually is staggering in the research.
It really is. Huawei isn't just a consumer brand. They are the infrastructure of the modern digital world.
Right. Hardware, massive radio access networks, the routers directing internet traffic, the literal undersea cables carrying data between continents.
Yeah, no other company on the planet had that kind of comprehensive reach in global telecommunications.
And that unprecedented reach absolutely terrified U.S. national security officials.
It terrified them because the underlying logic was simple and deeply paranoid. If Chinese state-championed companies controlled the central nervous system of the globe, the 5G infrastructure, then Beijing would effectively possess an omnipresent surveillance network.
So they'd have eyes and ears everywhere.
Exactly. In every allied capital, every corporate boardroom, and every military base relying on those networks.
So the U.S. government, and then expanding systematically under Biden, set out to dismantle Huawei's global reach.
They did.
And they didn't do it with military force. They did it by denying Huawei access to critical microscopic components.
Let's get into the mechanics of that, because it wasn't just a broad embargo.
No, it was very targeted.
They targeted something very specific. Field Programmable Gate Arrays, or FPGAs. What are these, and why are they the Achilles heel of a telecom giant?
So a field programmable gate array is a highly advanced type of integrated circuit. Unlike a standard microchip that is hardwired at the factory to do one specific task, an FPGA can be reprogrammed by the user after it's been manufactured.
So it's super adaptable.
Incredibly flexible and incredibly fast. And Huawei absolutely relied on these US-designed FPGAs to build the base stations for its 5G cellular networks.
Okay, but why did the U.S. care so much about these specific chips? Here is the critical dual-use problem. Those exact same FPGAs have massive, undeniable military applications.
Oh, I see.
You find them in electronic warfare jamming pods, in secure military communications, in advanced radar systems for fighter jets.
So the U.S. Commerce Department steps in and says, you can no longer buy this crucial piece of hardware.
Yep.
And because American companies, or foreign companies, using American software, dominated the creation of these chips, Huawei was suddenly cut off from the very building blocks of its technology.
Completely cut off.
The sources call this strategy technological asphyxiation.
It is a devastatingly effective strategy.
It's a brutal image, but a brilliant analogy. It's like, imagine two scuba divers fighting underwater.
Okay.
Instead of trying to outpunch the other guy or pulling a knife, you just calmly reach over and pinch their oxygen hose.
Right.
You don't need to be stronger than them if they can't breathe.
That captures the essence of the policy entirely. And this isn't just an ad hoc reaction to one company. This strategy of technological denial is the cornerstone of what the Pentagon formally calls the third offset strategy.
Okay, let's unpack this concept of offsets, because the historical context here is fascinating. What were the first two offsets?
The offset concept was born in the darkest days of the Cold War. In the 1950s, the U.S. military looked at the map of Europe and realized a terrifying mathematical reality. They could never match the Soviet Union tank for tank or infantrymen for infantrymen.
Soviets just had too many people.
The Soviets simply had overwhelming numerical superiority. So to offset that massive disadvantage in sheer mass, the U.S. turned to technological leaps.
Right.
The first offset was the development and deployment of tactical nuclear weapons. The logic was that technology could instantly neutralize numerical superiority.
A dark logic, but effective. And the second offset?
By the 1970s and 80s, the Soviets had caught up in the nuclear arena, achieving parity. So the U.S. initiated the second offset. This was the push into precision-guided munitions, stealth aircraft technology, and advanced battlefield networking.
The stuff we saw in the Gulf War.
Exactly. This was the technology that famously shocked the world and the Soviet military observers during the 1991 Gulf War, where American forces decimated a massive Soviet-equipped Iraqi army from beyond visual range.
So that brings us to today, the third offset.
Today, the U.S. faces that exact same historical dilemma, but against China.
Right, because of China's sheer size.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If a conventional conflict were to break out in the Western Pacific, China can deploy more ships, more aircraft, and more personnel. They have the home field advantage of proximity and sheer industrial mass.
So what's the plan?
The third offset, which was a strategy heavily championed by defense officials like Robert Work around 2014, is the absolute imperative for the U.S. to maintain a 1 to 2 generation lead in foundational military-related technologies.
So AI and drones.
Exactly. We are talking about artificial intelligence, autonomous swarms, directed energy weapons. The entire theory rests on the idea that if the U.S. loses its technological supremacy, it loses its deterrent capability entirely.
Wait, let's look at how that actually plays out in reality, because this is where the strategy feels incredibly risky to me.
How so?
Does aggressively suffocating China's tech sector actually ensure American safety? Or does it just back Beijing into a corner where they are forced to rapidly innovate and build their own indigenous supply chains from scratch?
It's a huge risk.
Right. By cutting off their oxygen, are we just forcing them to evolve lungs? Are we creating a Frankenstein's monster out of pure geopolitical desperation?
That is the central haunting question for U.S. policymakers, and the research shows that Beijing is actively answering it right now.
With the Made in China 2025 initiative, right?
Exactly. We have to look at Beijing's Made in China 2025 initiative. This wasn't a secret plan. It was a highly publicized, centrally coordinated industrial strategy launched back in 2015.
And what was the goal?
The Chinese Communist Party identified 10 core, future-facing tech sectors where China must achieve dominance. We're talking advanced robotics, aerospace engineering, clean energy vehicles, and crucially, next-generation information technology.
And they wanted to be self-sufficient in these.
Yes. The stated goal was for China to achieve 70% national self-sufficiency in these foundational materials and components by the year 2025.
70% self-sufficiency. That isn't just an economic goal. That is a blueprint for total geopolitical decoupling.
It is, and it was entirely driven by historical fear and present-day pressure. Beijing watched the U.S. expand its export controls. They watched the Commerce Department's Entity List, which is essentially a blacklist prohibiting U.S. companies from doing business with specific foreign entities balloon to restrict over 1,000 Chinese nationals, corporations, and research institutes.
Wow, over 1,000.
Right. Beijing looked at that and concluded that the United States was systematically trying to deny them the future.
And that plays right into their historical fears, right?
Yeah.
The century of humiliation.
Exactly. You have to remember the historical narrative that drives the Chinese leadership. They believe China suffered a century of humiliation because they badly lagged behind the West during the first 3 industrial revolutions: steam power, electricity, and the early computing age.
Right.
They are absolutely fundamentally determined not to miss the 4th industrial revolution, which will be driven by artificial intelligence.
So they're going all in.
Yes, so your Frankenstein analogy is highly relevant. U.S. pressure didn't crush their tech sector, it turbocharged a massive state-funded pursuit of absolute national
But
self-reliance.
think about the psychology of this. When you slam the door on a major world power, when you actively try to asphyxiate their most vital industries, they don't just sit alone in the dark feeling sorry for themselves.
No, they don't.
They go out and find new friends. They build a new network. And that brings us to the second major movement in this geopolitical shift, how China is building its own counter-network, the alternative axis.
Exactly. The ancient proverb, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, has never been applied on such a massive industrialized scale.
Right.
We are witnessing the rapid deepening of highly pragmatic, deeply transactional ties between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea.
And it's fascinating because it seems like U.S. economic weapons actually served as the forge for this new axis.
They really did.
The sources highlight a moment where a top White House official basically stated, "We are openly trying to do harm to the Russian economy with sanctions, but we are not openly trying to harm the Chinese economy. Our actions there are just about national security."
Right.
But to the leadership in Beijing, Moscow, and Tehran, that nuanced distinction was completely meaningless.
Oh, it sounded like semantic nonsense to them. They all view themselves as targets of a unified, coordinated, and relentless Western campaign to suppress them.
So the sanctions backfired.
Well, Western sanctions didn't successfully isolate these nations. They inadvertently acted as a gravitational pull, driving them into each other's arms to build physical and financial detours around Western economic choke points.
Do we have data on that?
If you look at the raw data points provided in the research, it's undeniable. Take Sino-Russian trade. Since the invasion of Ukraine, China has acted as a critical economic lifeline for Moscow.
Where exports surged, right?
Chinese exports to Russia have absolutely surged. And they aren't just sending consumer electronics. They are supplying microchips, massive trench-digging excavators, Kevlar helmets, and bulletproof vests.
Items that, while technically commercial, have glaringly obvious direct battlefield applications.
Exactly.
You can't dig a trench without an excavator, whether you're building a highway or a frontline defense.
Exactly.
And it goes far beyond Russia. Let's look at Iran, because this is where the financial scale gets dizzying. China signed a massive investment agreement with Iran. We're talking $400 billion over 25 years.
That agreement is monumental, and it completely alters the balance of power in the Middle East.
How does it work?
Consider the mechanics of this deal. China has committed to pouring hundreds of billions into Iranian banking systems, telecommunications infrastructure, modernizing their ports, expanding their railways, and upgrading their healthcare.
That's practically rebuilding the country. And what does China get in return?
In exchange, China secures a guaranteed, heavily discounted supply of Iranian oil for the next quarter century.
Oh, wow.
They are trading concrete and capital for deeply discounted energy security. And importantly, the pact includes clauses for deeper military cooperation, joint training, and vital intelligence sharing.
And China played this beautifully on the diplomatic front too, right?
They did.
Even while heavily backing Iran financially, Beijing managed to step in and broker a major, highly unexpected diplomatic thaw between Iran and its bitter historical rival, Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, that move stunned Washington.
I bet.
It helped break Tehran out of its diplomatic isolation while simultaneously cementing Beijing as a major trusted power broker in a region the U.S. traditionally dominated.
It demonstrated that China is no longer just an economic actor.
Yeah.
It is a primary diplomatic architect.
Exactly. But within this alternative axis, there is always the wild card, the entity that consistently makes the international community nervous. North Korea.
Right, North Korea. And I have to admit, reading the sources, I always wondered why Xi Jinping tolerates Kim Jong-un.
It's a good question.
Because historically, if you look back just a few years, Xi and Kim actually had a notably terrible relationship.
Oh, you really did?
North Korea's repeated nuclear tests and missile launches were incredibly destabilizing to the region. They gave the United States the perfect justification to surge its military focus, move aircraft carriers, and deploy anti-missile systems right up to China's borders.
Right.
It seems like Pyongyang is a massive liability, so why keep them around?
What is fascinating here is the cold, calculated nature of Xi Jinping's tolerance. Kevin Rudd's analysis breaks this down perfectly.
Okay, what's his take?
Yes, a volatile, nuclear-armed North Korea is undeniably a headache for Beijing. But you have to ask a very pragmatic question. Who are Kim Jong-un's missiles actually pointed at?
Well, not Beijing.
Exactly. They were certainly not pointed at Beijing. A North Korean nuclear capability is almost exclusively targeted at China's primary strategic adversaries: the United States, Japan, South Korea, and potentially Australia.
Ah, so Kim Jong-un isn't a partner, he's a utility.
Exactly. He is essentially a very loud, very dangerous distraction.
He's a strategic lightning rod.
That's the perfect term for it. By keeping the U.S. and its Pacific allies in a constant state of anxiety over Pyongyang's nuclear ambitions, North Korea severely complicates the threat environment for Washington.
Right, because they have to keep watching him.
It forces the Pentagon and the State Department to expend massive amounts of diplomatic bandwidth, intelligence resources, and military hardware focusing on the Korean Peninsula.
And every asset the U.S. devotes to monitoring North Korea is an asset not fully focused on China.
Precisely. Therefore, as long as Kim doesn't turn his aggression westward toward China, he serves as a highly useful strategic buffer and a relentless distraction that ultimately serves Beijing's wider geopolitical interests.
Okay, so we have Russia providing raw materials and military distraction in Europe, Iran providing energy and leverage in the Middle East, and North Korea acting as a chaotic buffer in Asia.
Yes.
But let's look at the reality of this alternative axis. Is this an actual alliance?
No, it's really not.
If we compare it to the Western architecture, if China were to be attacked, are Russian troops legally obligated to rush to their defense the way NATO's Article 5 dictates?
Not at all.
Or is this group just an island of misfit toys, a collection of isolated regimes bound together by nothing more than a shared, intense resentment of Washington?
It is entirely the latter. These are marriages of extreme convenience, not ideological brotherhood. They do not possess mutual defense treaties.
They don't actually trust each other.
In fact, if you look closely, Russia and China share a deep, historical, mutual mistrust regarding their shared border and influence in Central Asia. They are not allies in the traditional Western sense.
So what binds them then?
What binds them is a shared, urgent necessity to survive the pressure of Western sanctions and diplomatic isolation. However, Beijing is highly aware of the fragility of these relationships.
Right. They know they can't rely just on them.
China isn't just relying on rogue states to build its network. Its true geopolitical masterpiece, the most ambitious network-building endeavor in modern history, is the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI.
Yes, the BRI. Xi Jinping launched this grand vision back in 2013, and the sheer scale of his ambition is staggering.
It is.
It is frequently pitched to the world as a massive, benevolent infrastructure project designed to physically connect Asia, Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. And it's crucial to acknowledge that there is a desperate, genuine need for this.
Oh, absolutely. The Asian Development Bank has projected that developing Asia alone faces a $26 trillion infrastructure deficit by 2030.
26 trillion.
Yes. These countries desperately need ports, power grids, and highways. So China steps into that void with massive reserves of cash and concrete.
They absolutely capitalized on an unmet global need. But over the last decade, the BRI has morphed into something far more sophisticated than just pouring concrete.
It really has.
It is no longer just about physical roads, railways, and deep water ports, although those remain critical, such as the strategic port investments in Sri Lanka, Pakistan, or the Maldives.
Right.
The BRI has evolved into a vast digital and political network. Elizabeth Economy's research shines a spotlight on a crucial subcomponent, the digital Silk Road.
The digital Silk Road is fascinating.
We aren't just talking about asphalt anymore. We're talking about state-of-the-art Huawei data centers being built in Serbia.
Yeah.
We're talking about comprehensive AI-driven safe city surveillance systems installed across cities in Zambia and Zimbabwe. We're talking about massive arrays of fiber optic cables stretching across the ocean floor, connecting continents directly to Chinese telecommunications hubs.
And when you look at it that way, it changes everything. When I read that, it changed how I viewed the entire initiative.
Right. I started looking at the BRI not as a construction project, but as a global operating system.
That's a great way to put it.
Think about it in software terms. A developing country desperately needs to modernize. China shows up and offers to build the physical and digital infrastructure incredibly fast and at a fraction of the cost of Western competitors.
It's an offer they can't refuse.
But once that country downloads China's hardware, the ports and the 5G networks, they're essentially locked into Beijing's software updates in terms of service for the next century.
Exactly.
They're structurally locked into using Chinese technological standards, they're utilizing Chinese surveillance methodologies, and they are beholden to Chinese debt structures.
That is precisely the dynamic playing out across the globe. The sources describe this phenomenon as the export of techno-authoritarianism on the cheap.
Techno-authoritarianism.
Yeah.
Wow.
By providing these advanced, deeply integrated technologies to developing nations, the Chinese Communist Party inadvertently, or perhaps very deliberately, gains unprecedented eyes, ears, and structural leverage over foreign governments.
Because they run the systems.
Right. If Chinese companies run the data centers, manage the telecommunications grid, and operate the port logistics, Beijing gains immense silent influence over the very infrastructure that allows those modern societies to function.
And beyond the practical leverage, it generates a massive psychological impact back in Washington.
It really does, because policymakers in Washington are suddenly looking around the map and realizing that their traditional spheres of influence are disappearing.
Right. Regions like Latin America and the Middle East, which the U.S. historically viewed with a certain, proprietary arrogance as its own backyard or as locked-in partners, are being aggressively, successfully, and cheerfully courted by Chinese investment.
It induces a profound strategic anxiety in the West.
I can imagine.
Which brings us to the most volatile friction point of this entire geopolitical restructuring.
Okay, what's that?
Well, while Washington is frantically building its high-tech exclusive shield and Beijing is laying down its vast inclusive infrastructure network, what happens to everyone else?
Right.
The overwhelming majority of the global population lives in the expanding no man's land between these two superpowers. How are they surviving the crush of this competition?
That's the squeeze.
Exactly.
So if Beijing is locking down infrastructure in the developing world and Washington is building a high-tech fortress, what happens to a country that relies on both? Look at Europe.
Europe is a mess right now.
Europe is currently experiencing a full-blown geopolitical identity crisis over this squeeze.
They really are torn apart by this. The research meticulously breaks down Europe's fractured reaction into three very distinct competing camps.
Let's go through them. What's the first camp?
First, you have the strategic autonomy camp. This perspective is heavily championed by French President Emmanuel Macron, and it has incredibly deep structural roots in Germany.
Why Germany?
Well, for these massive export-driven economies, China isn't an ideological adversary. It is a critical, irreplaceable market. Think about the German automotive industry companies like Volkswagen rely heavily on Chinese consumers.
Right. They sell millions of cars there.
This camp believes Europe must forge its own path, remaining generally neutral in the U.S.-China struggle. They want to maximize Europe's economic opportunities and maintain their independence.
They just want to stay out of it.
They are absolutely terrified of being drafted into a new Cold War that would sever their supply chains and wreck their economies.
Basically, the please leave us out of it, we just want to sell luxury cars and designer handbags in peace camp.
Exactly. It is a pragmatism born of economic necessity. But then you look at the second camp, the hardliners.
And who are they?
These are often surprisingly bold, smaller states, particularly in Eastern Europe, whose historical memory makes them deeply distrustful of authoritarian regimes.
Okay, like who?
A prime example in the research is Lithuania. Yeah. Here is a country of fewer than 3 million people that absolutely infuriated Beijing by allowing the opening of a representative office that challenged Beijing's core territorial claims in the Pacific.
They just stood up to them.
They did. They suffered massive, immediate economic retaliation from China, but they held firm. They're deeply troubled by Chinese human rights abuses, rampant cyber espionage, and particularly China's no-limits partnership with Russia.
Wow.
For this camp, the dividing line between the liberal democratic West and authoritarianism is crystal clear, and they believe Europe must stand in absolute, uncompromising unity with the United States.
It's incredible to see a nation of 3 million go toe-to-toe with 1 billion.
It really is.
And then there's the third camp, which throws a wrench into the whole European Union consensus.
Oh, the third camp. The third camp consists of the far-right populist and nationalist leaders within Europe.
Like Viktor Orban in Hungary.
The clearest example is Viktor Orban, yes. When these leaders look at China, they don't see a threat. They look at China's illiberal, highly centralized, state-controlled political and economic model, and they actually admire it.
They admire it.
They see a template for retaining power. They actively favor closer relations, eagerly accept massive infrastructure investments from Beijing, and frequently act as a veto-wielding spoiler within the EU to soften any collective criticism of China.
So the European continent is completely structurally fractured.
Completely.
And nowhere was the intensity of this squeeze more visible or more bitter Then the battle over 5G networks. This wasn't just a polite debate about tech standards at conferences. It was a brutal civil war taking place inside European government ministries.
It was bureaucratic trench warfare.
How so?
Inside almost every major European capital, you had the economic and finance ministries locked in a fierce battle against their own intelligence and security ministries.
What were the economic ministries arguing?
They were looking at the sheer math of the national budgets. They were saying, look, Huawei's 5G technology is objectively excellent. Furthermore, it is heavily subsidized by Beijing, making it significantly cheaper than European alternatives like Nokia or Ericsson.
Which makes financial sense.
Right. They argued, if we want our industries to stay globally competitive, we need next-generation networks immediately, and we have to buy the most cost-effective option.
And meanwhile, the intelligence ministries are across the hall screaming, "Are you completely out of your minds?"
Precisely. The security ministries, who were simultaneously receiving intense classified pressure from the United States, argued that installing Chinese-made hardware into the core telecommunications grid of a nation would irrevocably compromise their national security.
They thought it was a Trojan horse.
They argued it would give Beijing a permanent backdoor into the continent's data. Furthermore, the U.S. made the threat explicit, particularly to allies like the UK. If you integrate Huawei into your networks, we will no longer trust your data security. It will undermine our intelligence sharing relationships, and it could jeopardize your standing in the Five Eyes intelligence alliance.
And for an intelligence agency, being cut off from American signals intelligence is a nightmare scenario.
It's the ultimate nightmare.
But let's look beyond Europe, because Europe at least shares a long-standing traditional alliance structure and cultural history with the U.S. What about the rest of the world? What about the global south?
That's where things get really complicated for the U.S.
Right. David Shambaugh's research points out an incredible statistic. The global south encompasses roughly 140 of the 191 member states of the United Nations. That is a massive, overwhelming voting bloc.
It's the majority of the world.
And they are actively, vocally refusing to pick a side in this superpower contest.
And this is where Shambaugh's analysis becomes highly critical of Washington.
Why?
He points out one of the greatest, most persistent failures of American foreign policy over the last 2 decades: the complete inability to craft a broad, compelling, positive strategy for the global south.
So they just don't have a pitch.
Exactly. For many of these 140 countries, China has already entrenched itself as their largest trading partner, their primary source of foreign direct investment, and their main builder of infrastructure.
Right.
The United States, on the other hand, frequently only shows up diplomatically to demand that these sovereign nations treat China as a security threat.
It's just demands.
The U.S. constantly forces a binary choice, us or them, that these nations deeply resent and simply cannot afford to make.
And compounding that diplomatic failure is the fact that the U.S. is losing the propaganda war in these regions, and they are losing it badly.
Completely.
This specific history blew my mind in the research. During the Cold War, the United States possessed this massive, highly effective instrument of public diplomacy called the U.S. Information Agency, the USIA.
Yes.
Founded by Eisenhower in 1953, this agency was a titan. It had over 11,000 personnel. It operated radio stations globally, ran physical libraries in foreign capitals, published magazines, and sent jazz musicians around the world.
It was a massive operation.
Yeah. Its explicit mission was to penetrate the information iron curtain and tell America's story directly to the global public. And historians generally agree it was incredibly effective.
It was highly effective.
But then what happened? Having won the Cold War, the U.S. decided it didn't need to tell its story anymore, and Congress simply abolished the agency in 1999.
It is viewed in hindsight as a monumental strategic error.
Yeah.
Because in geopolitics, just like in physics, nature abhors a vacuum.
Right.
The U.S. packed up its public diplomacy apparatus and went home. Today, if you look at regions like Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, China has rushed into that vacuum and completely dominates the regional media landscape.
How are you doing it?
Chinese state media networks, particularly Xinhua, provide constant, high-quality news feeds to local media outlets in these countries, either completely free of charge or at incredibly heavily subsidized rates.
Wow, free news.
Meanwhile, Western newswire services like the Associated Press or Reuters remain prohibitively expensive for many of these local independent newsrooms.
Let's put ourselves in the shoes of a local newspaper editor in an African capital. You are operating on a shoestring budget. You need to fill the international news section of your paper. Are you going to pay thousands of dollars for a Western wire service? Or are you just going to grab the free, well-translated copy provided by Xinhua?
It is a purely economic decision for the editor, but the geopolitical impact is massive.
I can imagine.
As a direct result of this dynamic, the daily reporting about China in the global south is overwhelmingly positive. It focuses constantly on themes of development, mutual cooperation, and technological triumph.
Because they're the ones writing it.
Exactly. Conversely, because they are often still relying on whatever free snippets of Western news they can find, the reporting on the United States is frequently framed around political dysfunction, societal conflict, or military aggression.
That is wild.
The U.S. essentially disarmed its public narrative capabilities at the exact moment China was investing billions to build a highly resourced, highly sophisticated global communications network.
It's not just narrative dominance, it's physical infrastructure. Look at a country caught right in the middle of this infrastructure tug of war. The microcosm of Greece in the research is the perfect example of this absurd balancing act.
Oh, Greece is fascinating.
Greece is threading the needle, playing both sides with incredible audacity.
The Greek example is a fascinating case study in modern geopolitical survival. On one hand, following the devastating European debt crisis, Greece was economically starved. They desperately needed foreign capital, and their European partners were imposing brutal austerity.
So China stepped in.
China stepped in with open checkbooks. The Chinese state-owned shipping giant, Hisesco, systematically invested in and effectively took over operations at the port of Piraeus.
Right.
They transformed it from a struggling, inefficient facility into one of the busiest, most vital hubs for Chinese goods entering the European continent. A former Greek government official literally described the Chinese investment in Piraeus as putting in the head of the dragon.
The head of the dragon. If you stop the story there, that sounds like an absolute undeniable strategic victory for Beijing right inside Europe. But it's not that simple, is it?
No, because Greece is highly aware of its security geography. They are a NATO member, and they rely on the American security umbrella to counter regional rivals.
So they can't just abandon the U.S.
Right. So simultaneously, they are aggressively courting the United States military, literally just miles away from the Chinese-run port of Piraeus at the Elesina shipyard. The Greek government is heavily facilitating and signaling U.S. military investment.
Okay.
Greece enthusiastically agreed to join the U.S.-led Clean Network Initiative, effectively boxing Huawei out of its future telecommunications grid. And Greece proudly hosts the USS Herschel Woody Williams, one of the U.S. Navy's massive expeditionary sea-based ships.
So they're playing both sides.
Greece is attempting a high-wire act, reaping the massive economic benefits of Chinese logistics investment without sacrificing an inch of its historic Atlantic security orientation.
Wait, isn't there a massive blind spot in the American approach to countries like Greece or even closer allies? Kishore Mahbubani, one of our key sources, issues a very blunt warning about a persistent, dangerous arrogance in Washington.
He does. He's very critical of it.
He argues that U.S. policymakers still operate under the wishful thinking that America is the undisputed, unipolar dominant power, and that other nations should essentially just fall in line and take orders.
Right.
He specifically points to the relationship with Australia, warning that if the U.S. demands Australia act merely as a loyal deputy sheriff in the Pacific region, it will be disastrous. If Washington treats every interaction as a loyalty test, aren't they just alienating the exact countries they desperately need?
Mahbubani hits on a critical structural vulnerability in Washington's worldview. When you frame every bilateral relationship, every trade deal, and every diplomatic visit as a loyalty test, are you with us or against us in the grand struggle against China, you force sovereign nations into a corner they despise.
Right.
Most nations, whether it's Australia, Indonesia, Brazil, or Greece, absolutely do not want to be proxy battlegrounds for a superpower conflict. They want to pursue their own sovereign national interests.
Obviously.
If the United States only offers a military security umbrella, but simultaneously demands that these countries commit economic suicide by decoupling from China, it is an objectively terrible deal for most of the world.
Because at the end of the day, you cannot eat a security umbrella. You can't pave a road with a defense treaty.
Exactly. And that harsh reality brings us to the final dimension of our deep dive. Because sitting on the fence, trying to balance these two titans is becoming increasingly dangerous.
The board isn't static.
The board is not static. Massive global shocks are permanently altering the landscape.
The world has changed permanently in just the last few years, and we have to talk about the massive violent shock of the Russia-Ukraine war. How did the reality of a massive land war in Europe permanently alter the U.S.-China equation?
The fallout from the invasion of Ukraine altered the geopolitical calculus in Beijing and Washington in two profound ways. First, it demonstrated the devastating, swift, and unified power of Western alliances when truly provoked.
Right.
The speed with which the U.S., the European Union, and crucial Asian allies like Japan and South Korea moved to freeze hundreds of billions in Russian central bank assets, levy sweeping export controls, and essentially eject Russia from the global financial system deeply shocked the leadership in Beijing.
They didn't think the West could pull it off.
It proved that the concept of the West wasn't nearly as fractured, decadent, or paralyzed as Chinese state media had frequently portrayed it to be.
Right.
Furthermore, Putin's aggression spectacularly backfired strategically by breathing new life into NATO, pushing historically fiercely neutral nations like Finland and Sweden directly into the military alliance.
And what was his second profound shift?
It brutally exposed the reality of untested militaries. Prior to the invasion, the Russian army was widely considered the second most powerful military force on the globe.
We all thought they were.
Yet, in the early months of the war, they stumbled disastrously against a smaller, highly motivated Ukrainian force backed by Western intelligence. The Russian military displayed a stunning lack of modern combined arms combat experience.
Let's define that. What exactly is combined arms combat, and why is it so difficult to pull off?
Combined arms combat is the ability to seamlessly integrate different branches of a military infantry, armor, artillery, air support, and electronic warfare into a single, fluid operation.
It sounds incredibly complicated.
It requires incredible communication, decentralized decision-making by lower-level officers, and massive logistical competence. The Russians failed at it. Their top-down, rigid command structure paralyzed them when plans went wrong.
And China is watching this.
For the top brass of the People's Liberation Army in China, watching this unfold was a stark, glaring warning. The PLA has not fought a major sustained conflict since a brief, incredibly bloody border war with Vietnam in 1979.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize it had been that long.
They've spent decades modernizing their equipment, building stealth fighters and hypersonic missiles. But the Russian failure proved that cutting-edge hardware looks great on a parade ground, but means very little if your command structure lacks the actual combat experience to execute complex, chaotic operations under fire.
So the West flexed its economic muscles, and the realities of modern warfare were laid bare. In response to this shock, we are witnessing a massive, panicked unwinding of the last 40 years of global economic theory.
We really are.
We are suddenly hearing vocabulary that simply didn't exist in mainstream policy a decade ago. Words like friendshoring, de-risking, and supply chain resilience are now the driving forces of global trade. The era of win-win globalization, where we assumed everyone would just trade peacefully and get rich together, is effectively dead. We have entered a zero-sum reality.
But here is where we collide with the most glaring, almost absurd friction point in all of the research. We can call it the Great Technology Paradox.
Let's talk about that.
We discussed earlier the U.S. third offset strategy, the imperative to heavily fund and out-innovate China in military tech to maintain a deterrent.
Right.
But the U.S. defense and intelligence establishment experienced a moment of sheer panic when they realized how this technological race was actually playing out in the real world.
This brings us to the Georgetown University study. Honestly, this is the part of the research that completely broke my brain. Let's walk through this.
It's wild.
The U.S. is spending immense political capital trying to choke off China's access to advanced technology through export controls. But researchers at Georgetown went and looked at over 300 publicly available procurement contracts, where the Chinese military, the PLA, was buying artificial intelligence equipment. What exactly did they find?
The researchers found that out of all those contracts supplying advanced AI technology to the Chinese military, less than 20% of the companies involved were actually subject to any U.S. export controls.
Wait, meaning what exactly?
Meaning that the People's Liberation Army has had virtually no difficulty whatsoever simply bypassing the blockades.
You're kidding.
They are buying cutting-edge American-designed chips completely off the shelf from commercial markets and then plugging those exact chips directly into Chinese military systems.
So all the export controls are basically useless.
The U.S. government is spending billions of taxpayer dollars to out-innovate China in a classified arms race, while the Chinese military is simply going shopping for the fruits of American commercial innovation on the open market.
They are literally going shopping in Silicon Valley to build the target recognition, AI, and autonomous drone systems designed to kill Americans in a potential conflict.
It's crazy.
And because of the way commercial tech works, where a chip used in a video game console is fundamentally similar to a chip used in a missile guidance system, the U.S. government has historically struggled to stop these sales without utterly destroying the profit margins of its own tech champions. Which brings me to the ultimate challenge, the question that shadows this entire deep dive. Is a new Cold War truly inevitable? Listen to this quote from Matt Turpin, a former U.S. National Security Council director, highlighted in the sources.
It's a great quote.
Speaking about this technological race, he said,
Right.
"It is nearly impossible to pull ahead with an offset if the Chinese are in the car with us."
It is a phenomenal quote because it highlights why the term Cold War is historically lazy and dangerously inadequate for our current situation.
So?
During the first Cold War, the U.S. and the Soviet Union were like two separate, heavily fortified castles shooting arrows at each other across a vast plain. Their economies barely interacted.
Right, there was an iron curtain.
But the U.S. and China today are not two separate castles. They're like two fighters locked in an incredibly tight, desperate embrace where drawing a knife and striking the other inevitably deeply injures yourself.
In the car with us. How can you have a traditional Cold War with a country that manufactures the antibiotics your hospitals rely on, processes the rare earth minerals in your electric vehicles, and buys billions of dollars of your most advanced commercial silicon?
You can't. Not without catastrophic pain.
Yeah.
China's deliberate policy of civil-military fusion purposely blurs the lines between commercial enterprise and military application, taking advanced civilian tech and legally mandating its sharing with the PLA.
So we're completely entangled.
The U.S. is now scrambling frantically to untangle these incredibly complex supply chains. They're trying to create zero-trust microelectronics and build new semiconductor fabrication plants in Arizona and Ohio.
But that takes forever.
But moving a semiconductor supply chain isn't like moving a shoe factory. It takes 5 to 10 years and tens of billions of dollars. It might simply be too late to fully separate these economies without causing a global depression.
Wow.
The U.S. desperately wants to build a defensive moat, but it's trying to dig that moat in an ocean of deeply interconnected global commerce.
So let's step back and look at the entire board we've mapped out. We've covered an incredible amount of ground, and the complexity is staggering.
We've traced the architecture of the West, from the U.S. fortifying the Pacific with the Quad and the nuclear shock of AUKUS, to the realization that Washington has explicitly weaponized Silicon Valley to financially asphyxiate companies like Huawei.
We watched China respond not by retreating, but by deepening its alternative axis forging transactional survival-based bombs with Russia, Iran, and North Korea, while simultaneously casting a massive techno-authoritarian net across the developing world through the physical and digital infrastructure of the Belt and Road Initiative.
We examined the agonizing squeeze felt by the rest of the world. Europe, hopelessly bureaucratically divided between the allure of commercial interests and the terror of security fears. And the Global South, firmly demanding neutrality while their information landscapes are increasingly dominated by Chinese state media.
And finally, we landed on the impossible paradox of modern conflict. Fighting an adversary who is intimately, deeply entangled in your own supply chains, who is legally buying the very chips you invented to offset their military power. It is a stunningly complex board where every move has a devastating countermove.
And exploring all of this leaves us with a profound, almost existential dilemma to consider regarding how this all ends.
Exactly. We always want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over, something that pulls all these massive geopolitical threads into a single sharp point.
If you look back at history, the great world-altering wars were ultimately decided by access to raw materials and physical energy. World War II was a war of industrial mass. It was decided by access to steel, rubber, and aluminum. The Cold War was defined by the raw, terrifying physics of atomic energy and the uranium required to harness it.
But if the next global conflict is decided by computing power, if victory goes to the nation that can process the highest sheer volume of ones and zeros to power their artificial intelligence, coordinate their autonomous drone swarms, and guide their hypersonic missiles, we run into a terrifying, singular geographic reality.
We do.
Both of these massive superpowers, the United States and China, rely almost entirely on the exact same single tiny island in the Pacific, Taiwan, for the fabrication of the most advanced microscopic chips that make those calculations possible.
So the question you have to ask yourself as you watch the news tomorrow is this. As the world fractures into these rigid new alliances, are we actually heading toward a traditional war of military dominance? Or, through decades of economic entanglement and technological outsourcing, have we inadvertently built a new, bizarre system of mutually assured economic destruction? A system where neither superpower can afford to fire the first shot because doing so would instantly destroy the very island that produces the digital oxygen they both need to survive?
It's something to keep in mind the next time you see a map of the world. The real borders, the ones that actually dictate war and peace, aren't the physical lines drawn on the land anymore. They are the invisible supply chains connecting the chips in our pockets and the weapons pointed at them. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the simple narratives you hear and always keep looking below the surface.